Hello friends, today we are going to look into the .NET family or the .NET ecosystem. Lately there has been some new additions, lot of changes in the .NET ecosystem, and this has brought lot of confusion for the developers and the coders out there. So in this video we are going to look into what are those differences between the .NET framework, .NET Core and the .NET standards, and then what are the changes that they bring into the table, how they are connected to each other, when to use what. So coming up.
Spread it back.
Welcome to Help Me Coder, the channel which talks about technology and helps the coder community out there. And in today's video, we are going to discuss about the new kids in the town, which is .NET Standard, the .NET Core, and our very old .NET Framework. So before we jump into learning each of these things and how they're connected to each other and what are the confusion and fuss about all these things, let's see on the Visual Studio how they look like. So if I turn to my Visual Studio and I click on Create New Project, so if you see there are different projects that I can create over here. So the different .NET platforms over here like .NET Core, our classical .NET Framework, which is all this, and then the new one, the .NET Standard. So keep watching and I will let you know when to use which solution. To see how these different platforms basically sit together, we will use an architecture diagram. So if I go back to my presentation, so this is how the architecture diagram looked earlier. So we had different .NET platforms like your .NET Framework, .NET Core, and even Xamarin, which I have not mentioned over here. So they all had their own base class libraries or the BCL. Now you may ask, what is this BCL? So base class libraries are the built-in types, which means that all the system.io operations or the arrays or string manipulations or even your reflection, all those built-in types are defined over here, which you use in your classes or the code that you write. So every platform had its own BCL. So this was a problem because if you want to move your code from one platform to another, you need to know about the BCL in the different platform. This was also a problem for Microsoft because every time they have to create a new platform, so if there is a need to create a new platform, they have to create a new BCL for the same. And even as a developer, I need to understand what is this BCL and what I can do with that BCL. So there were a lot of issues with this approach. So what Microsoft realizes is, why don't we just have a one single BCL layer instead of having separate BCLs, so that the managing of things and the code reuse can be even greater. Plus getting a new platforms will not be a problem if your new platform adheres to the standards of that new BCL. So they came up with something called .NET Standard, which is which I will be showing you with my next slide, which is this. So this is the .NET Standard library, which unifies the whole base class library layer. So now every platform that comes up will have to adhere to this base class library, which is the .NET Standard library. So what is .NET Standard? .NET Standard is a set of APIs that all .NET implementations must adhere to. So they are kind of a contract basically that all .NET implementations must implement. So any new .NET implementation that happens in future must implement that contract. So if you create an application which targets a particular .NET standard, then this means that your application will run across different .NET platforms or the .NET implementations out there. So there may be a lot of different .NET standards in the market. So you have 1.0, 1.2. So there are different .NET standards. But if you say that you implement your code based on a .NET standard, which is .NET Standard 1.0, for example, then your code will run across all the different .NET platforms which have adhered to that .NET standard. So this is the benefit. You don't need to worry about the different platforms out there. You just make sure that you write your code into a standard. So once you write your code to a particular standard, then definitely it will run across different platforms. I can show you this better with a matrix that is provided by Microsoft. You can get it through the link I have shown in the description section below. So if you see, these are the different .NET standards over here. This is like 1.0, 1.1 till 2.0. Now, how to read this matrix? The lower the .NET standard you have means the greater number of applications you can target. So if you are running a .NET standard, your code on .NET standard 1.0, definitely this means that you can run your API or the code on many different platforms. But higher the number of .NET standard, so if you run your .NET standard as 2.0, means you have a greater number of APIs under your belt. So you can write lot of different code, plus you have, so because you have so much APIs to use, so you can write different code. But this means the number of platforms that you can support will be little bit less than the lower .NET standard version. So we need to take note of this. I will show you through an example right now how this .NET standard things work. Remember, .NET standard is something that you don't write code on. Even though there is a .NET standard base class library, you can use that, but then mostly you will not directly write on .NET standard code. You will create a .NET Core application or a .NET framework, which in turn they adheres to a particular .NET standard. It's kind of a contract basically between all the frameworks or the .NET implementations which they adhere to a particular standard. So let's see through this with an example. So I have opened my Visual Studio over here. Then I can go to File, New Project, and you will see different .NET implementations like .NET Core, Standard, and then the framework. What we want to do over here and see is that how this .NET Standard comes into play when you work with different implementations of .NET, and how you can share your code across different .NET implementations easily. Also, I would like you to show over here that the matrix that we just saw, how that matrix comes into play over here, and how you need to make sure you are on the right .NET standard version. So to start it, let's create a .NET standard class library. So let's name it as standard class library. So once I do this, it will create a new project. So once this opens up, we will write the code, a simple code that we want to have it accessible across different .NET implementation. So let's say that this code is about addition, and there is a method called addition, so and which we want to expose into different .NET implementations and in different places. So we just create public int addition, and we expect two numbers over here, and once the given array will return back is just the addition of these two numbers. So I will say x plus y. So pretty simple code. Now I would like to show something over here. So if you see what is the .NET version that we are running on, if you see over here, if I go to properties, .NET standard version is 2.0. So we are running in the latest version. There are other target standard versions from 1.0 till 2.0. So we are running on the latest one right now. Let me do one thing. I will add system data over here, system.data, and pretty easily I can get this, because as I told you, the higher the version you go, the more libraries you will have access to. So I have access to system.data, and then I can basically use this ds is equal to new data set. So let me give me the IntelliSense dataset. So this one also is dataset of intelligence. Okay, so now this one works nicely, which is because it is on 2.0. Now let me show you, if I decrease the framework version that it supports, I change it to .NET Standard 1.0. Let's see if does it supports. So if I go back over here and I try to build this solution, see, it is giving me error saying that, you know, this type space could not be found, RUF, and this namespace is also cannot be found, because as I told you, the higher the version of standard you go, the more scripts you have. The lower version of standard you come, the more applications you can support. So as we have to support a lot of application, I will be supporting core and framework. So let it be for now, keep it to this one. So I will just remove my dataset command and let it be at 1.0. Fine. So now let's add another project. So let us add a framework project now. So I will say add new project, go to framework, and I will add a console. Let's go with console. So I will add a console framework and I will say it's okay. So once this console framework gets created, what I will do is I will add a reference to this standard class library. So once this is done, I can access that standard class library dot class 1 which is object. Just don't look into my coding practices. So I just name it, I just created an object over here and I can access the addition method over here. So I will just pass something like 10, 20, and that's it. It will give me the result. So I will just write something like console dot write line, and over here I can just say the addition value is plus o dot addition. I just copy pasted it over here, I don't need it in that place. And then let's say console dot read line. That's it. So this one should run pretty easily. So if I do a build, so succeeded, so the build succeeded. Now I can add one more project. So I'm showing you how across different implementation. Let me open a core. So I will create a .NET core application. So I will just say this is a core console. So once this is created, so this is, and I will add a reference to this project, so which is I will add standard class library, and I will say okay. Once you do that, I can copy paste the same code from here onto this place. So now after I have written all the code over here, let me show you things. So this is three other solutions over here. One is standard, which I'm referring in console and the framework part. Now this standard one is on 1.0 right now, correct? So let me check what is this framework part on right now. So framework is referencing framework 4.7. So this means because it is on 1.0, this means it can refer a lot of different application. It can run on framework, it can run on console, because you're on higher version. So if I go back to my matrix, so if you see, if you are on 1.0, and then you can refer lot of different places, you can refer it, but your number of APIs that will be available will be little less. So over here, the number of API, you saw that system.data was not available on 1.0. So the number of APIs will be less. Now if I increase this standard to 2.0, so let us increase the standard to 2.0. So I will increase it to 2.0. This means that system data and all those different APIs will start running. But then if I go to my framework and I bring my framework of this .NET framework, which is running on this line, if you see, if I bring it to even if I bring it to 4.6, it will not run. So if I bring it to 4.6, I save it and then I build it. This will not run. So why it is not running? It's saying that the .NET standard version 2.0 cannot be referenced by a project that target .NET framework 4.6. So your 4.6 basically is best fit for standard version 1.3. You cannot target 2.0 version with 4.6. You need at least 4.6.1 to target that. So if I change it to 4.6.1, this should run. So if I then build it, this ran successfully. So build one is succeeded. So if you if I make this one as a startup project and I run this, it will run without any issue. So this is the addition value is 30. Now what we saw over here, we saw that we need to make sure, first thing that we saw over here, that the .NET standard specifies a specification that all different frameworks or the all .NET implementations must follow. So your for example, .NET framework is following .NET standard implementation, like 4.5 follows 1.0, 4.5.1 follows 1.2. So each .NET framework or .NET implementations are following a particular .NET standard. So let us see another .NET implementation by Microsoft, which is .NET Core. This is targeted towards Microsoft's ambition to have a cross-platform and open source based framework, which means you write code in one place and run it everywhere. Actually, Microsoft.NET has always been associated with Windows-based application, but to target all its audience, Microsoft realized that it has to have an open source based framework so that it can target all its audience and their code can run everywhere, not just the IIS. So that's the reason they have come up with the .NET Core. So .NET Core basically is a cross-platform .NET implementation for your websites, servers, and console-based apps that can run on all the different OSs like your Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So where you can use it, when to use it, and when you should use .NET Framework or when should use .NET Core. So we will look into this in the topic, which is like where they are best fit for. Definitely they are best fit for cross-platform applications where you want your code to run on Linux, Mac, Windows, mobile. So definitely you will look for cross-platform, because if you go with framework, then your code will only run on Windows or Windows mobile based applications, not on the Linux and Mac OS. There were other ways to do that, but this is not part of this topic, so not go into it. But definitely in future, .NET Core is to be used for any cross-platform based applications that you're going to develop. The next thing is the microservices and the containers. So what is microservice? Microservices are small services that can run individually or they can run with each other so that they can create a bigger application. So nowadays people are creating microservices so that they can run their code on different OS. They can run their code on their silos. So moving a code is also easy. So .NET Core is a lightweight and a fast framework. So definitely it's best to use for microservices, and definitely container and microservices goes hand in hand. So you can use microservices for containers as well. You can use .NET Framework for containers as well, but then it has a bigger footprint, so not advisable to use .NET Framework for containers. If you can support it with .NET Core or your API can support through .NET Core, then definitely you go with .NET Core, not the framework. Many .NET framework. What do we mean by this is that if you have a lot of different .NET framework or versions or implementations sitting side by side, then you need to use .NET Core to connect to these different .NET implementation and can still communicate and work with each other. Also, if we talk about performance and scalability, then Microsoft recommends ASP.NET Core to use for these scalable systems. This may even result in better user experience and cost savings when you achieve these through less number of VMs. Here I would like to also bring up a point on the cross-platform. When we talk about cross-platform, so it comes to our mind like what will be the development environment for us. So .NET Core comes with a command line interface across all the platforms, and the commands are almost the same, so you can use it in all the different platforms like your Linux, Mac, Windows operating systems. Also they have IDE. There is an IDE for Windows, as we know, Visual Studio. There is a Visual Studio for Mac as well. Plus there is VS Code editor which has IntelliSense, so you can use VS Code with your Mac and Windows based systems. So this is .NET Core all about, which is Microsoft's ambition to have a cross-platform framework. You can write code in one and execute it everywhere. So let's understand now the third implementation, which is the .NET framework, or the Superman of .NET implementations, which we have been using from ages, and it's not dying soon, so it's still running on. So there are some places where you need to use .NET framework still, and people and developers are pretty much familiar with this framework. They have been using it. So from the development point of view, what is .NET framework? Developers use .NET framework to create Windows desktop applications and server-based applications, which include your ASP.NET applications. Where should you use them? Where they are best fit for? Definitely for Windows desktop based applications, you need to use .NET framework, and if it is WPF or Windows Presentation Foundation or Windows Forms or workflow related services, you still need to use .NET framework. You cannot use .NET Core for these all things. Other than that, if you have been using if you have created an application or it's an existing application built on .NET framework, then there is no point in changing it to .NET Core or migrating it to .NET Core, unless and until you want to make it as a cross-platform based application. Other than that, if there are some third-party NuGet libraries which are still not running on .NET Core based systems, then you have to use .NET framework for that. So for those kind of scenarios, you still can use .NET framework. Hopefully I would have helped you in understanding what are the differences between .NET Standard, .NET Core and .NET Framework. If you still have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. Do like and subscribe our channel Help Me Coder, because your likes and subscribe help us to keep going. Thanks for watching and happy coding.